The wind that sweeps across the Bavarian plains in late March carries a particular kind of chill, one that bites through wool and settles deep into the timber of isolated farmsteads. In 1922, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, stood one such farmstead, Hinterkaifeck. It was not a grand estate, but a modest, hexagonal cluster of buildings, a house, a barn, and a stable, all connected under a single sprawling roofline. It was a place designed for survival, built to withstand the isolation of the German countryside. Yet, on the morning of April 4th, the isolation felt different. It wasn't the peaceful solitude of a working farm. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that had persisted for 4 days. For the residents of the nearby village of Kaifeck, the silence was becoming impossible to ignore. 7-year-old Casilia Gabriel had not been to school. Her mother, Victoria, had missed Sunday service at the church, where her soprano voice was usually a fixture in the choir. The mail had begun to pile up, untouched. Even the local repairman, Albert Hoffner, who had spent hours at the farm that morning fixing a stationary engine, had seen no one. He had worked in the yard, the rhythmic clanking of his tools the only sound in the air, yet not a single member of the Gruber family had emerged to greet him or pay for his labor. When he finally left, he described an eerie sensation, a feeling of being watched from the darkened windows of the upper floor. But that wasn't the strangest part. Despite the absence of the family, smoke had been seen rising from the chimney over the weekend. Neighbors later recalled seeing a light flickering in the kitchen window on Saturday night. To the casual observer, life at Hinterkaifeck appeared to be continuing, yet the people who lived there had vanished from the world. To understand what happened in that barn, we must first look at the people who inhabited it. The patriarch was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, a man described in local records as stern, reclusive, and deeply unpopular. He lived with his wife, Casilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Casilia and 2-year-old Josef. Joining them on the very day the silence began was Maria Baumgartner, a new maid who had arrived only hours before the sun went down. The Grubers were not well liked in the community. Whispers of a dark family dynamic had circulated for years, fueled by Andreas's abrasive nature and a history of legal troubles regarding his relationship with his daughter. They were a family that kept to themselves, a closed circle that few dared to break. However, in the days leading up to the end of March, the wall Andreas had built around his family began to crack. He had started telling neighbors about strange occurrences, things that a man as hardened and pragmatic as Andreas shouldn't have been bothered by. It started with a newspaper. Andreas had found a copy of a Munich daily on his porch, a paper that no one in the house had subscribed to and that the postman denied delivering. Then, there were the footsteps. In the fresh crust of late winter snow, Andreas had discovered a trail of tracks leading from the edge of the forest, directly toward the farmhouse. They were the prints of a single man, clear and deliberate. But as Andreas followed them, his blood must have run cold. The tracks led to the house, but there were no returning prints. Whoever had walked out of those woods was still somewhere on the property. Andreas had searched the barn. He had checked the tool sheds and the attic. He found nothing. Yet the feeling of an intruder persisted. He told a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, about a set of keys that had gone missing and about scratches on the lock of the family's tool chest. He spoke of hearing footsteps in the attic, directly above his bed, in the dead of night. Yet, when he offered to show Schlittenbauer the tracks, the wind had already begun to drift the snow, blurring the evidence into nothingness. And that's when things began to shift from a state of unease to something far more sinister. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the farm went dark. It is believed that one by one the family members were lured or called into the stable. There is no clear consensus on how the killer managed to draw them out individually, but forensic reconstructions suggest a terrifying progression. First the elder Casilia, then Andreas, then the daughter Victoria, and finally the young girl, Casilia. Each was met with a heavy, sharp tool, a pickaxe or mattock, belonging to the farm itself. The brutality was methodical. The bodies were stacked one on top of the other in the corner of the stable, covered with hay and a discarded door. But the killer was not finished. Moving from the stable into the living quarters, the intruder found the new maid, Maria, in her bedchamber, and finally the 2-year-old Joseph, sleeping in his cot in his mother's room. In the span of an hour, 6 lives were extinguished. In most crimes of this magnitude, the perpetrator flees the scene as quickly as possible, driven by a desperate need to escape the gravity of their actions. But at Hinterkaifeck, the narrative takes a turn that defies traditional criminal psychology. The killer did not leave. For the next 4 days, whoever committed these acts lived in the house with the dead. They made themselves at home. Police reports later noted that the beds had been slept in recently. The pantry had been accessed. Meat had been sliced and eaten. Smoke continued to billow from the chimney as the intruder stoked the fire against the Bavarian cold. Most unsettling of all, the cattle had been fed. The cows were milked, and the livestock remained healthy and calm. The killer had stepped into the role of the farmer, maintaining the rhythm of the homestead while the family lay beneath the hay in the barn just a few yards away. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. When the search party, led by Lorenz Schlittenbauer and 2 other villagers, finally entered the barn on April 4th, they expected to find a family incapacitated by carbon monoxide or perhaps a sudden illness. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. The discovery of the bodies was so traumatic that it shattered the composure of the village. The local doctor arrived to perform preliminary autopsies on the kitchen table, and it was here that the first layer of the mystery was peeled back. The medical examiner noted something chilling about the youngest victim, 7-year-old Casilia. While the others had likely died instantly, the child had survived for several hours after the attack. In her final moments, she had remained lying in the hay next to the bodies of her parents, clumps of her own hair found clutched in her hands, a sign of extreme emotional and physical distress. As the authorities from Munich arrived, they were faced with a crime scene that had already been compromised by the well-meaning but panicked villagers. Yet, even through the chaos, one question rose above the rest. Why would anyone stay? Why feed the cows? Why cook meals? There was no evidence of theft. Significant amounts of gold coins and jewelry were found untouched in the house. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was something far more personal, or perhaps far more calculated. The Munich police began to look closer at the family's history, searching for a motive that could explain such a prolonged and intimate violation of a home. They looked at the townspeople, at the disgruntled former laborers, and at the shadows of the Great War that still hung over Germany. Records suggest that the investigators were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of suspects. Over 100 people would eventually be questioned. But as they dug into the life of Victoria Gabriel, they found a secret that suggested the killer might not have been a stranger at all. The secret centered on 2-year-old Joseph. While he was raised as Victoria's son and Andreas's grandson, the village of Kaifeck was rife with rumors regarding his true paternity. Some records suggest that Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the man who led the search party, had once been in a relationship with Victoria and was the likely father. Others, however, pointed to a much darker possibility involving Andreas himself, a theory backed by prior court records that had seen both Andreas and Victoria serve brief prison sentences for incest years earlier. Schlittenbauer's behavior on the day the bodies were discovered only deepened the police's interest. While the other men in the search party stood back, paralyzed by the sight of the carnage in the stable, Schlittenbauer reportedly moved through the scene with a strange, purposeful energy. He touched the bodies, turned them over, and even entered the house alone using a key he claimed to have found. His familiarity with the farmstead and his seemingly unshaken demeanor led many to wonder if he was searching for something, or perhaps ensuring that something had been destroyed. Yet, when questioned, Schlittenbauer had a plausible, if tragic, explanation. He claimed his reaction was driven by a desperate hope that his son Joseph was still alive. His proximity to the family gave him motive, and his knowledge of the farm gave him opportunity. But as the investigation widened, the evidence began to pull in conflicting directions. What happened next remains unclear, as the Munich police, led by Chief Detective Jörg Reingruber, struggled to make sense of the physical evidence. The weapon, a farm tool known as a mattock, was missing from its usual spot. It wasn't until a year later, when the farm was being demolished, that it was finally found hidden in the attic, tucked beneath the floorboards. It was a heavy, dual-headed tool, one side a sharp blade, the other a blunt pick. The precision of the strikes suggested someone with significant physical strength and a chilling level of composure. And that's when the investigation encountered its most baffling hurdle: the sheer logistics of the killer's stay. Evidence layers found within the house suggested that the intruder hadn't just stayed for a few hours to hide from the sun. They had essentially moved in. The family's dog, a Spitz, had been tied up in the stable. It was found alive but barkless, its voice gone from days of frantic howling. The killer had fed it, along with the rest of the livestock. This detail is particularly haunting to historians. It suggests a person who, despite being capable of unimaginable violence, still felt a compulsion toward the clockwork duties of farm life. Or perhaps it was a tactical decision, a way to ensure that the lowing of hungry cattle wouldn't alert the neighbors that something was wrong. But even this theory has its flaws. If the goal was to remain undetected, why light the fires? Why allow smoke to rise from the chimney, a clear signal to the village that the house was occupied? Some historians believe the answer lies in the psychological state of the perpetrator. The 1920s were a period of profound instability in Germany. The country was reeling from the aftermath of the Great War, and the countryside was populated by thousands of displaced soldiers, many of whom suffered from what we now recognize as severe PTSD. These shadow men often lived on the fringes of society, moving through the woods and surviving on what they could scavenge. Is it possible that a drifter had been living in the attic of Hinterkaifeck long before the murders took place? This would explain the newspaper Andreas found, the footsteps in the snow, and the noises in the ceiling. It would suggest a predator who had observed the family for days, learning their routines, their weaknesses, and the exact moment they were most vulnerable. However, the stranger in the attic theory struggles to explain why such a person would stay after the killings. A drifter would likely take what they could carry, the gold, the food, the valuables, and vanish into the forest. To stay was to risk everything. As the police sifted through the personal stories of the victims, a new layer of tragedy emerged. Maria Baumgartner, the maid, had only been in the house for a matter of hours. Her sister had dropped her off at the gate that afternoon, watching as Maria carried her small suitcase toward the front door. Maria had been hesitant to take the job. Her previous employer had heard rumors about the haunted nature of the farm and the ill temper of Andreas Gruber. Maria's arrival was a cruel twist of fate, placing her in the path of a killer who was perhaps already waiting in the shadows of the upper floors. The escalation of the investigation saw the police offering a massive reward for information, but the village of Kaifeck remained largely silent. In a small, tight-knit community, secrets are often kept not out of malice, but out of a collective desire to avoid the gaze of the law. There is no clear consensus on whether the villagers knew more than they let on. Some suggest that the stern and unpopular Andreas had many enemies who would have been happy to see him gone, but the inclusion of the daughter, the maid, and the innocent children in the slaughter turned any potential local sympathy into cold terror. As the months turned into a year, the farmstead at Hinterkaifeck became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the morbid. The house stood as a skeletal reminder of the violence, its windows staring blankly at the road. But the physical structure of the farm was only holding part of the truth. In 1923, the decision was made to tear the buildings down. The locals couldn't stand the sight of them, and no one was willing to buy a property with such a blood-soaked history. It was during this demolition that the most significant piece of physical evidence was uncovered: the mattock, still stained with dried blood, hidden in the very attic where Andreas had heard the footsteps. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Beside the weapon, investigators found something else: a small nest made of hay and blankets. It was positioned directly over the master bedroom, with a view through a small gap in the floorboards. Someone had been living there. They had been watching the family sleep, listening to their conversations, and waiting for the perfect moment to descend. The discovery of the nest solidified the theory that the killer had been an inhabitant of the house long before the night of March 31st. But it also raised a new, more disturbing question. If the killer was already there, living in the walls, what was the catalyst that finally drove them to act? And why did they choose that specific night, the night the new maid arrived? The turning point in the investigation came when the police began to look into the possibility of a revenge motive involving Victoria's late husband, Karl Gabriel. Karl had supposedly died in the trenches of France during the Great War in 1914. His body, however, had never been recovered. In the chaos of the front lines, many men were buried in unmarked graves, but rumors persisted that Karl had not died at all. Could a man, believed to be dead for 8 years, have returned to find his wife with another man's child, and his father-in-law ruling the household with an iron fist? The theory that Karl Gabriel had returned from the dead was more than just village gossip. Several soldiers from his regiment had reportedly seen him fall in the trenches, but in the fog of war, certainties were rare. Records suggest that some of these men later recanted their statements, or claimed they hadn't actually seen him die, only heard that he had. This ambiguity opened a door that the police were forced to walk through. If Karl Gabriel had survived, he would have returned to a farmstead, where he was no longer legally the master, to a wife who had moved on, and to a father-in-law who had always treated him with disdain. But the trail of the dead husband began to grow cold as investigators realized the logistical nightmare of such a return. How could a man hide in a village where everyone knew his face? Unless, of course, the village wasn't looking for a ghost. And that's when the investigation took a turn toward the professional criminal element. Two brothers, Anton and Karl Gump, became central figures in the inquiry. They were known criminals in the region, men with a history of violence who had been part of a radical paramilitary group. A woman who had been involved with one of the brothers later claimed that he had confessed the murders to her on his deathbed. However, like so many leads in the Hinterkaifeck case, the confession was second-hand, the evidence was circumstantial, and the timeline remained frustratingly blurred. The collapse of the investigation was not due to a lack of effort, but a lack of modern forensic science. In 1922, fingerprinting was in its infancy. DNA was a concept for the distant future. The police were forced to rely on witness testimony, which in a community as insular as Kaifeck was often tainted by personal vendettas or a desire to protect one's own. By the mid-1920s, the case had stalled. The farm had been razed to the ground, leaving nothing but a scarred patch of earth and a small memorial cross. But there was one final, macabre twist to the investigation that many historians find particularly unsettling. In a desperate attempt to find a lead, the police took the heads of the 6 victims. They were sent to Munich to be examined by clairvoyants and psychics, a practice that, while bizarre today, was a legitimate, if controversial, tool of the era. The psychics, however, provided no breakthroughs. The skulls were never returned to the bodies. They were kept in a police laboratory in Munich, only to be lost forever during the Allied bombings of the city in World War II. The victims of Hinterkaifeck were buried in a nearby cemetery, forever incomplete, their heads missing, just as the answers to their deaths were missing. But that wasn't the end of the story. In the decades that followed, the file on Hinterkaifeck remained technically open, a haunting cold case that refused to die. In 2007, the case was revisited with a level of technological sophistication the original investigators could never have imagined. Students at the Bavarian Police Academy took on the mystery as a graduation project, applying modern criminal profiling, high-resolution analysis of the original crime scene photos, and advanced behavioral psychology to the century-old evidence. The results of their study were both revelatory and frustrating. Using modern profiling, they were able to rule out many of the historical suspects. They concluded that the motive was likely not robbery, but a personal, emotional one. The way the bodies were covered, the way the intruder stayed to care for the animals, and the specific focus of the violence suggested someone who felt a deep, albeit twisted, connection to the farm or the people within it. The students eventually narrowed their search down to a single individual. They believe they know who killed the residents of Hinterkaifeck. However, out of respect for the descendants of that person, who are still living in the region today, they chose not to release the name. The findings were definitive, yet they offered no closure. The disappearance of the physical farmstead and the loss of the victims' remains have left us with only the archival documents, the black and white photographs of the stable, the maps of the tracks in the snow, and the witness statements that contradict one another at every turn. We are left to wonder about the person who sat in that kitchen, eating the Gruber's food while their bodies lay cold in the barn. Was it a man driven by a singular, burning vengeance? Or was it someone who simply wanted to exist in the silence of a house that wasn't theirs? There is no clear consensus on why the intruder stayed. Some suggest it was a matter of survival, a place to hide, a source of food, and a warm fire in a world that had become hostile. Others believe the stay was the ultimate expression of power, a way for the killer to fully possess what they had destroyed. Today, if you visit the site where Hinterkaifeck once stood, you will find nothing but a flat expanse of Bavarian farmland. The wind still carries that same chill, and the forest still looms at the edge of the fields. There is a small shrine, a place for quiet reflection, but the earth itself seems to have moved on. What happened next remains unclear. Not because we lack the facts, but because the truth of what occurred in those final 4 days is something that may be impossible for the rational mind to fully grasp. The intruder at Hinterkaifeck did not just commit a crime. They stepped into a life that wasn't theirs, and for a few days they became the ghost in the machine of a working farm. The reason they stayed, the reason they fed the cattle, and the reason they eventually vanished back into the shadows remains one of the most haunting enigmas in the history of criminology. We are left only with the image of a flickering light in a window, a light that should have been a sign of life, but was instead the only witness to a house of the dead.